Robert H. Jackson Center and to this extraordinary opportunity to meet and listen to an extraordinary man. First, the Robert H. Jackson Center was formed this year for the purposes of preserving the legacy of America's advocate, Robert Jackson. Hopefully you all received a one-page statement of our goals. We are a work in progress, and we look to the community at large, the lawyers in specific, with regards to how best we can accomplish many of those goals. 2 weeks ago, Ambassador Dolibois advised me that because of the events of September 11th, the Montreal conference had been canceled. Nevertheless, he vowed at age 83 to honor his commitments. I can tell you yesterday, Ambassador Dolibois and his wife drove 7 hours just to be with us today. That's remarkable. Thank you very much. We're honored. A quick biography of Miami of Ohio University. He was naturalized in 1941, married to his wife in 1942, drafted and assigned to the Military Intelligence Center, where he was trained as an interrogator. He was intimately involved in the rescue of the Lipizan stallions from potential harm by the Russians. And he just told me on the way down that that he's part and parcel, you'll see his personage in the Walt Disney movie, should you ever have it, in the rescue of the Lipizan stallions. After the war, he was assigned to the Central Continental Prisoner of War enclosure in his native Luxembourg for a role of which he will discuss today. After World War II, his life continued to be distinguished as he worked for Procter & Gamble and was active in the affairs of the University of Miami of Ohio for over 35 years. Mr. Ambassador, you need to know that there are several alums in the audience today, and I know you've met some of them. In 1981, he was appointed ambassador to Luxembourg by President Reagan, a tour of duty that lasted until 1985. He's the author of several articles, including a book, Pattern of Circles, which I would highly recommend you purchase and possibly have autographed later during the reception. I'm his agent. Talk to me. By the way, there are only a few books left, so if you're interested, don't wait. In order to put Ambassador Dolibois into a time frame, indulge me in sharing the following film.
World War II was both a war and a crime. Millions of innocent people were killed, and millions more lost their homes and property. The victims cried out for justice. Those who brought this suffering must be made to answer for their crimes.
After World War I, the Allies had decided in the peace treaty that people accused of war crimes should be tried. And one of the many concessions made to the Germans after the First World War was a change which the Allies had agreed to in the Versailles Treaty, that the Germans would try these criminals themselves. Well, that proved an absolute and total fiasco. And the Allies were not about to try that a second time.
Near the end of the war, the Allies organized a War Crimes Commission and set up a system for bringing criminals to justice. The commission decided that individuals who committed atrocities against persons or property would return for trial near the scene of their crime. Individuals accused of specific crimes, like killing prisoners of war or downed airmen, would be brought before military courts. An international tribunal would try the major war criminals, Hitler and the men of his inner circle. But Hitler, Joseph Goebbels, and other high-ranking Nazis committed suicide before they could be arrested.
The notion that there ought to be a trial under international law took hold and was really exemplified by Justice Jackson, Robert Jackson, who took leave from our Supreme Court and strongly advocated running a trial, which in my view had lots of merit, because if nothing else, it was going to establish, forgetting the legal aspects of it, it was going to establish the Nazi record in an indelible fashion.
One by one, the Allies found and arrested the military commanders of the Reich, the men who ran the Nazi war machine. Chief of the Luftwaffe, Reichsmarschall Hermann Goering, surprisingly turned himself in to the U.S. Army. His captors received him more like a visiting dignitary than a prisoner of war.
When the press learned that Goering had fallen into American hands, of course they wanted an interview. So the Army produced Goering for a press conference, and Goering came out of the house in which he had been staying and sat under the trees in the garden and was thoroughly enjoying his press conference with the Americans, the give and take. And one of the questions was, do you realize that your name is on the list of war criminals to be tried? And this shook Goering. And he replied, no, I didn't know that, and I can't imagine why. But from this point on, he was not enjoying the press conference. There was nothing in his treatment at this point which gave him any idea that he was going to be looked on as a war criminal. He was allowed to wear his uniform, his medals, and I think that he thought that everything was going fine.
Goering's celebrity treatment ended abruptly when the Army moved him to a prisoner interrogation center.
It was there that he was stripped of his medals, and the ceremonial dagger that he wore was taken away from him, and his insignia was removed. And I think it was at this time he realized that all was not well.
Like Goering, May of 1945 saw Captain John Dolibois of the U.S. Military Intelligence Division being assigned to the Central Continental Prisoner of War enclosure located at Mondorf Palace in his native Luxembourg. Captain Dolibois, together with 4 other Army personnel, had a mission at the prisoner of war enclosure. Supreme Court Justice Robert Jackson was to serve as the prosecutor for the United States at the 4-Power International War Crimes Tribunal in Nuremberg. We were charged, says Captain Dolibois, with getting the information he and his staff needed. There was much to learn about the personalities and characteristics of the Nazi leaders. We knew little about the roles many of them played in the conspiracy with which they would be charged. Who gave the orders to execute prisoners of war? Who was responsible for the final solution? What did the people know about concentration camps, slave labor? That was our mission. The following photo was shot on the front steps of the Palace Hotel by Time magazine. It was the only group picture permitted. It was called the Class of 1945. As you look at the picture, you will see a gap in the very last row. Captain Dolibois said, "If I had stood up straight, my face would have been in the portrait too. I'd been in charge of lining up the Class of 1945 and ducked down when the photographer was ready. I've regretted my shyness of the moment ever since."
Was Hermann Goering. Goering was the highest-ranking Nazi at the first Nuremberg trial. In addition to being head of the Air Force, Goering controlled large parts of the economy and was instrumental in the Holocaust. As head of the Prussian police and Gestapo, he was a creator of the concentration camp system. Admiral Karl Dönitz was the German naval strategist. Before Hitler committed suicide, he appointed Dönitz president of the Reich. Rudolf Hess was one of Hitler's earliest collaborators and had taken down Hitler's dictation of Mein Kampf. Admiral Erich Raeder commanded the German fleet until 1943, when he resigned after disagreements with Hitler. Joachim von Ribbentrop was foreign minister. He gave speeches about Hitler's peaceful intentions, but was part of the conspiracy to invade Germany's neighbors. Baldur von Schirach was the Hitler youth leader. His job was teaching Nazi ideology to millions of young Germans. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel was Chief of Staff of the High Command of the German Armed Forces. He was in charge of battlefield operations. Under Keitel's direction, the German army killed millions of civilians in Poland and the Soviet Union. Fritz Sauckel procured slave labor from occupied territories. Most were worked to death or gassed. Hjalmar Schacht was Reichsbank president in the 1930s. With important international banking connections, he funded Hitler's rise to power. Hans Fritzsche controlled Nazi radio propaganda. His broadcasts incited fellow Germans to commit crimes against humanity. Walter Funk was wartime president of the Reichsbank. He worked closely with the SS in receiving the property of Jews murdered in the gas chambers. Konstantin von Neurath was governor of Czechoslovakia after its brutal takeover. Julius Streicher was Nazi party boss in Nuremberg. The most anti-Semitic of Nazi propagandists, he did more than anyone to incite murder of Jews. Albert Speer was Hitler's architect and friend. He designed the stadium in which the Nuremberg rallies took place. In charge of war production from 1942, Speer achieved spectacular results using slave labor. General Alfred Jodl was chief military planner. He masterminded the German invasion of Europe. In 1941, he planned the attack on Russia, in which 13.6 million Soviet troops were killed, including prisoners who were shot or starved to death. Wilhelm Frick was the author of Nazi laws. Arthur Seyss-Inquart deported Jews from Holland. Hans Frank was governor of Poland, where some of the worst crimes were committed. Franz von Papen, first vice-chancellor of the Third Reich. Alfred Rosenberg, the Nazi philosopher. Ernst Kaltenbrunner missed the opening of the trial due to illness. Kaltenbrunner was head of the Reich Security Police and had overall responsibility for concentration camps. Britain's Lord Justice, Geoffrey Lawrence.
Wilhelm Keitel.
All defendants pleaded not guilty.
Ich bekenne mich nicht schuldig. I call on Consul of the United States.
American Chief Prosecutor Robert Jackson opened proceedings.
Mr. President and members of the tribunal.
The privilege of opening the first trial in history for crimes against the peace of the world imposes a grave responsibility. The wrongs which we seek to condemn and punish have been so calculated, so malignant and so devastating that civilization cannot tolerate their being ignored because it cannot survive their being repeated.
At the conclusion of Ambassador Dolibois' speech at the Robert H. Jackson Center on September 26, 2001, we had the opportunity to retreat to the Gold Room and there have an one-on-one interview with Ambassador Dolibois. I think you're going to find this very interesting.
He came to Nuremberg. And the first time I met him was in the course of a conversation that I had with Goering and Douglas Kelly, the psychiatrist. Right. And Kelly told Goering that he had tried to talk to Hess, but that Hess had amnesia and couldn't recall anything, didn't know anybody. And Goering then volunteered to talk to Hess, saying, remember they were in solitary confinement. So he said he wanted to talk to Hess, and maybe he could help Hess regain his memory. So he took Goering to Hess, and Hess is a complete blank. And he played the act very well. He didn't know Goering at all. And Goering was extremely annoyed with Hess because Hess didn't remember him. And he was convinced that Hess was playing an act, that he wasn't really suffering from amnesia. Well, I'm getting ahead of my story, but as it turned out, in the course of the trials, in the middle of the trials, Hess suddenly stood up and said that he remembered things, that the amnesia was self-induced, and he had just been faking it. So Goering had analyzed him correctly, and so had Douglas Kelly. Kelly told me, this is not a real amnesia because he had deliberately talked himself into not remembering. And people who have gone through a catastrophic experience, who don't really want to remember the tragedy that they've seen, can actually shut it out of their minds. I don't want to talk about this. It makes me sick to talk about it. And if you keep giving that answer often enough and long enough, then you really talk yourself into forgetting. And that's what Hess had done. But when time came that he wanted to talk, it all came back. Well, Kelly then thought we ought to give the Rorschach test to Hess. And Hess could speak fluent English. But Kelly said, I still want you to be with me. We'll conduct the interview, the test in English, but just in case she needs an interpreter, then you'll be with me. So I actually was a bystander. I didn't participate in that test. In other tests I did. I would ask the questions, interpret. So then after that, I would go back and see Hess on a number of occasions, just to chat with him and get to know him better. All right, now, with that relationship established, let me say that I'm one of the people who is convinced that Hess flew to England on Hitler's orders, that he knew exactly where he was going and what he was doing. And I based that on my interviews with Hess, and I base it on my talks with some of the other prisoners. I'm rambling all over the place here and get it all together. Hitler exercised what is known as the Führerprinzip, the principle of leadership, which was typically Hitler. And the Führerprinzip was that he never told A what B was doing, and B never was told what A was doing. Hitler gave everybody his job, but he didn't tell anybody else what that guy was going to do. That was one thing. And we kept hearing about the Führerprinzip in the course of their defense. I didn't know about this because I wasn't informed. Hitler exercised the Führerprinzip, and he merely told so-and-so what to do, but he didn't tell me that that's what so-and-so was doing. Okay. In England at the time, it was a very strong pro-German, even pro-Nazi element. Duke of Hamilton, Sir Oswald Mosley, the American ambassador to Great Britain, Joseph P. Kennedy, was sympathetic to the Germans. The royal family, the House of Hanover, they're related, they're cousins. So even the royal family, including Edward VIII, who was quite, not necessarily pro-Nazi, but pro-German because of his bloodline, his ancestry, and everything else. So there was a pro-German element in England. Hess had met the Duke of Hamilton at the Olympics, and they had established a relationship. So Hess's mission was to fly to Scotland, land on the Duke of Hamilton's estate, get to the Duke of Hamilton, and tell him that Germany was about to invade Russia, Soviet Union. If the British would just lie low, stay out of it, I mean, just don't do anything, don't attack us, and keep the Americans out of it, definitely. That would give the Germans an opportunity to invade the Soviet Union and create a bulwark between Western democracy and Eastern communism. So Hess's mission was to tell the Duke of Hamilton that the Germans were going to invade the Soviet Union, but that the British should lie low, keep the Americans out of it for that reason. So he ends up getting a Messerschmitt plane. And he flies to England going through all the radar. He's not detected. Somebody had to know he was coming. And somebody had to clear the skies for his approach. He landed by parachute about 20 yards from where he wanted to land. It was that well done. He was an experienced pilot. In fact, he and Goering always argued about who was a better pilot. Goering, of course, was an ace. Hess was not. He landed on the Duke of Hamilton's estate, and a farmer with a pitchfork saw him land and thought the invasion had started, and marched him off to the local constabulary. And the whole thing was blown. So, of course, under a great cover of secrecy, the British put Hess under arrest, put him in prison. They didn't allow us to interview him. Nobody was allowed to talk. Churchill was smart enough to know that if the Americans, maybe the American media, find out that there's a pro-German element in England, the Americans might not be so hot about getting in the support of England, getting involved in World War II. That was one of their thinking, keep the Americans out of it, as long as we were kept in the dark. So they kept Hess for 4.5 years, incognito. And then when the trial started, of course, they were obligated to bring him. Now, I fault the British for not exposing Hess in the first place. I think the story could have come out earlier. Now Hess arrives in Nuremberg, and he's very flaky, his personality. You never dared ask him, how are you today? Could he tell you? He had something wrong with him all the time. I mean, he was a hypochondriac. I think he had just about every doctor in Germany check him out. And after he ran out of doctors, he went to all the quacks. He tried everything. He was a hypochondriac from the word go. And he was a vegetarian. Even when he was invited to Hitler, to dine with Hitler, he brought his own food, which Hitler resented, and finally told him that he had to eat the same thing he had. Well, Hitler was a vegetarian too, so the two of them got along fine, but they finally ended up chewing on the same cabbage. But Hess was interesting because of his quakery. He was really not a dyed-in-the-wool Nazi. That did not motivate Hess. What motivated Hess was his great admiration and affection for Hitler. Hess was a personality. He was not a leader at all. He was a follower, and he needed a father image. He was born in Egypt. He was 15 years old before he ever set foot in Germany, of German parents. His parents were diplomats in Egypt, and he came to Germany to be a student under the tutelage of Haushofer, the German economist. And Haushofer taught him, and eventually Hess became involved in the Hitler movement and became one of the staunchest followers, because Hitler to him was the father figure. He admired, loved Hitler, he would die for Hitler. Not necessarily for Germany, not for the Nazi cause, but for Hitler. That was the connection. So when Hitler named him number 3, in case Hitler died, Goering would follow. In case anything happened to Goering, Hess would be the leader of the Third Reich. Goering objected very strongly to that. And Hitler tried very hard to calm Goering down. Said, you know, it's never really going to happen because something happens to me, and this is a Goering quote, if something happens to me and you become the Führer of the Reich, you can always eliminate Hess if you don't want him to succeed you. I mean, those are the machinations that were going on. So Hess was really a puppet. He was a non-entity. And he didn't try to defend himself. He was absolutely not interested in what was going on, the trials, until about the middle of the trials. And then for some strange reason, he suddenly, I say, woke up and began to defend himself. And he didn't put up much of a defense, but at least he answered questions, and he never did take a stand, but he was willing to be interviewed. Now, he was sentenced to life imprisonment. The Soviets insisted in their minority report that he should have been hanged. And it wouldn't have made any difference to Hess one way or the other. He had more or less given up his family until after he went to prison. I mean, he sacrificed his family relationship to follow Hitler. So Hitler was his family, was his everything. So he lived to be 93 and then died in Potsdam. Oddly enough, during our embassy years, General John Mitchell, who was the commandant of the Berlin Brigade, these were the crack American troops who were in Berlin, 20,000 of them, who would be our front line of defense in case the Soviets ever caused a problem. They were on a suicide mission because they were completely surrounded by the Soviets, but they were our very finest soldiers. And General John, Major General, was the commanding officer. And I had invited him to come to Luxembourg to speak at our Memorial Day at the American Cemetery, where Patton is buried, by the way. And Mitchell came, and we became good friends, and he invited Winnie and me to visit them in Berlin. So we had a real treat riding the General's train through East Germany. General's train was a locomotive, dining car, and sleeping car. Just the two of us and my military aide, Lieutenant Colonel DeLuca, Army, and his wife. Just 4 of us had a whole train with barbed wire on both sides of the tracks all the way through East Germany, from Fulda to Berlin. The train wasn't allowed to stop. The doors were locked. But because I was an ambassador, every time we came to a town, the train would slow down, and I would have to go to the door, and the window would be rolled down, and there'd be a Soviet armed guard presenting a salute, and I would turn their salute, and then the train would speed up again. Beautifully synchronized, and a big ego trip. Sure. I love it. You know, every time having these Soviets present arms, I'd go on through. They treated us very correctly. Well, we got to Berlin, and the reason I mention this is General Mitchell organized a helicopter flight over Berlin for me. And so we flew over Potsdam, which is behind the Berlin Wall. And we flew over Potsdam, and I saw Hess in his garden. He had a little garden in a prison enclosure. And that particular month, the British were guarding him. If it had been, I mean, the Russians were guarding him, I'm sorry. The Soviets were guarding him. If the British or the Americans or even the French, if it had been their turn, I would have been allowed to visit him, and I would have loved to go see him 40 years later and talk to him again and see if he remembered me. Well, that was the extent of my experience with Hess. But on the basis of what I said earlier, my talks with Hess, knowing how Hitler operated, this Führerprinzip concept of leadership, don't tell that guy what this guy's going to do. Hitler wrote in Mein Kampf that if Germany ever had to fight a war on two fronts again, Germany would lose that war. This is in Hitler's own opinion in Mein Kampf. So when he was ready to invade the Soviet Union, he couldn't afford to fight the Soviet Union and have the British, possibly the Americans, to fight on the other side. He had to get them out of it. So I'm convinced that Hitler sent Hess on a mission without telling the other Nazi leaders. They hinted at it, but they couldn't say for sure, yes, we know that he did it, but they fudged. Sure. They wanted to be loyal, but at the same time they wanted to let. So my conclusion is Hitler sent Hess. When the mission failed, and this farmer of the pitchfork took Hess to the constabulary, Hitler's explanation was that Hess was a traitor and he'd lost his mind. And you lose your mind and then you fly a Messerschmitt to England in the fog. I wouldn't mind losing my mind on those cases. So,
on the way down today, you accomplished to the trial.
Well, actually, we tried the Nazis on 3 counts. War crimes, no question about war crimes. The rules of warfare are all spelled out. You have the Geneva Convention, the Versailles Treaty, the Warsaw Convention, how to treat prisoners of war, what to do in case a plane is shot down, the pilot has to evacuate, and he's dangling helplessly in a parachute. He's a free man. When the German fighters would machine gun a pilot helplessly dangling in a parachute, that was a crime, a war crime. When a submarine torpedoed the ship at sea, it was supposed to surface, pick up the survivors, deliver them to the nearest port. If they didn't do that, it was a war crime. When prisoners were not properly treated, or as they were at Malmedy, executed, that's a war crime. So no question about it. These guys had committed war crimes. We had a documentary evidence. Much of the evidence we had was documentary, which is why a guy like Keitel was a military man, and there are people today who say, well, he just did his military duty. Well, I saw documents. I identified documents officially signed by Keitel, giving the Einsatzgruppen in occupied countries, occupied by the Germans, the right to execute the underground or any resistance fighters or Jews or gypsies, whatever they wanted. And Keitel gave the official order. So he was hanged for that reason, not because he was a commanding officer. Okay, those are war crimes, no question about it. I don't think that Justice Jackson paid that much attention to war crimes per se, because that had already been established. There was no legal challenge in pursuing that. You know, any judge in Oxford, Ohio could have worked on that one. Secondly, crimes against humanity. Thou shalt not kill. I mean, that's in the Bible. 2,000 years ago. We know thou shalt not kill. It is wrong. It's murder. It's in the 10 Commandments. When the Nazis persecuted Jews and put them in concentration camps and subjected them to slave labor and then executed them in gas chambers, that was murder outright. Crimes against humanity. Genocide, out and out, period. No challenge there legally. To Justice Jackson, I think the challenge was, and he explained that to us in a speech on the 9th of September, and I know you have that in your archives. It doesn't say where that speech was given, but according to my memory, it was given at Nuremberg to all of us who were involved in the trials. The legal staffs, prosecutors, the guard element, the officers of the guards, and the military intelligence people and people like me. And he explained the purpose of the trials to us. And I quote him in my book. And that quote in my book comes from memory out of the speech he gave, I think it was on the 9th of September, that you have in your archives here. And that is what he stressed was to prevent future aggressive wars, illegal aggressive wars, where one nation invades another nation and violates its territory, enslaves its people, commits genocide. A violation of a treaty or a non-aggression pact is a crime against the peace. Now, heretofore, that had never been established. No one had ever been tried for a crime against the peace. And Justice Jackson had been criticized, and so had all the prosecutors, for trying these men for crimes against the peace when it had not been previously established. But Justice Jackson said such laws are made at the expense of human beings. And he pointed out also between the lines and in fine print that if you're going to punish somebody who has committed a crime against the peace by breaking a treaty and committing genocide, and you have to catch them. In other words, don't go to war unless you win. If you don't win that war, you're not going to punish anybody for crimes against the peace, certainly not for war crimes or crimes against humanity. So the unwritten lesson of the International Tribunal was, if you're going to fight a war for righteousness and for justice, go in the fight to win. Don't go into a war like Vietnam if you don't want to win, because you're not going to punish the guy who invaded South Korea if you don't catch him any more than you can try a bank robber if the police don't catch him, or a murderer if he's not arrested. So if you're going to try somebody for genocide, you got to catch him. And if you're going to catch him, that means you got to win the war. So I think that's a message that I get out of all of this. And Justice Jackson's emphasis was on crimes against the peace. To him, that was really as I understood him, without my own, I don't have a legal background, but I understood him to give that message. Now, we failed completely. I mean, there have been 69 wars since we had war crimes trials. All of them aggressive wars. All of them violations of treaties. All of them violations of non-aggressive pacts. So the message there is, if you're going to try them, you got to catch them. You got to win the war.
You mentioned genocide.
This is an incident that probably sticks most in my mind. If there had ever been any doubt in my mind that the Holocaust happened, that particular incident, of which I'll talk in a moment, convinced me that it was real. I had visited Dachau the day after it was liberated, quite by coincidence. I was on a search for prisoners for detailed interrogation, strategic subjects for detailed interrogation. And I was just going, I had orders to go wherever I wanted to go. And those are orders by command of General Eisenhower, which meant I never went hungry or I never went without a place to sleep. And I had a driver and a jeep. And we just went wherever the battle was going on and prisoners were being taken. And we had just fought a battle in Munich. It was toward the end of the war. And we were heading toward Munich when we ended up at Dachau, quite by accident. And it was such a horrible sight that I still, sorry, I still can't talk about it. So I didn't, people say, well, didn't you, what was it like? What did you see? And I don't want to talk about it. So I dismissed it from my mind. I was practicing the Hess theory of amnesia, I guess. Well, then the war ended. And I served my 3 months in Luxembourg. We then moved the prisoners to Nuremberg. And before we flew them to Nuremberg, the day before actually, we had a convoy of some of the general officers, like Dönitz, Grand Admiral Dönitz, and Kesselring, and Blaskowitz, who was a three-star general, and some of the other lesser criminals who were going to be witnesses. And we had a convoy to take them to Oberursel in Germany, which was going to be the Military Intelligence Service Center for General Eisenhower's headquarters, which was in Frankfurt, the IG Farben. And we were in the Taunus Mountains in the Military Intelligence Service Center, which was a former Gulag, a prisoner of war processing center operated by the Germans. We put them in the Gulag, and we took it over and made it a processing center, a military intelligence service center for the USFET, European U.S. Forces and European Theater headquarters. And that was to be my new station. So we were taking these prisoners to Oberursel prior to moving the other prisoners to Nuremberg. And I was in charge. We took them in ambulances. I was in one of the ambulances. And we led the convoy into Oberursel and turned over the prisoners to the authorities there. And then I was commander of the empty ambulances back to Luxembourg. And we were traveling what is known as the Hunsrück-Höhenstraße. That is the high road in the Hunsrück mountain region along the Rhine, going into the Rhine. Just a high road, mountain ridge road. We were traveling. And we came upon a military convoy, which was stalled. GI 2.5-ton trucks. They were all lined up, canvas, tarpaulins over it, all the trucks. And there was a Jeep in the command, and there was a captain in charge of the Jeep, in the Jeep, talking on his intercom. And obviously they were in trouble. They were stalled because the hood of his Jeep was raised, so they had motor trouble. So I stopped my convoy, we had 6 ambulances, no 5, 7 trucks, 5 ambulances, and my Jeep. So we stopped, and I got out and talked to the captain. What's the problem? And while talking to him, he explained that they were having an engine problem. I had this terrible, terrible odor, smell. And just looking around to see what smelled so bad, I saw some of my own drivers of the ambulances vomiting by the side of the road. And I said, "Look, my God, what are you carrying, Captain?" And he didn't say anything. He just went to the first truck and threw the tarpaulin back, and the truck was just loaded with bodies. Obviously concentration camp inmates, because some had still the striped trousers, which are very familiar to us. They had been dug out of a mass grave and were being hauled somewhere else in this convoy. And that's when I knew the Holocaust had happened. It was real. And it wasn't just rumor. Anyhow, that was a horrible experience. And as it turned out, then I took over the convoy because they were being met about 20 miles down the road by some others. They were transferring the load. So we took them, we led them down the road for about 20 more miles. And then we went on to Luxembourg, and they went whatever their mission was. So. But that to me was evidence. Nobody has to convince me that it really happened. I saw other sites. I visited Mauthausen after the war. I visited Bösingfeld, which was a women's concentration camp, and because there were a lot of Luxembourgers in it. But that was months later. It was actually 1946. And there it was just like people visit Auschwitz today. It's a tourist trap. But if you saw the real thing, there's no question in your mind that this happened. And it shouldn't happen again. And this is what Justice Jackson was working for. He was dedicated. I admired that. In retrospect, I didn't understand it as well as I do now, having aged considerably since then. And having studied and learned and talked about it. And our embassy has contributed to it because I had an opportunity to expand my knowledge of these experiences during those 4 years, dealing with classified material and being on the inside of the way the government functions. But I've admired Justice Jackson because of this mission of his to try to outlaw aggressive warfare, which failed. But you have Rwanda, the Tutsis and the Hutus. You have Somalia. You have Haiti. You have Kosovo, Bosnia, Herzegovina. All of the aggressive wars in the Sudan, where they still have slaves. You know, this genocide business goes on and on. In Ethiopia, where they persecute Christians, and in the Sudan, where they persecute Christians. You have all of that all over again. It continues. So the Nuremberg trials were a failure, except that we meted just punishment in a fair and judicial way to the people who committed crimes against humanity and war crimes. We didn't prevent future wars through that process. That's the lesson I learned.
With this memory of what you just talked about seared the Holocaust, and then to have to go sit down and talk as we're talking to the Hermann Goerings and to the strikers, did that affect you?
Yes. You know, I mentioned in my talk that I had Nazi fatigue.
Yeah.
And that's what I meant. We were thoroughly trained, and this was the psychology of interrogation. We were trained how to be interrogators, to, you know, don't smile, don't raise your eyebrows. If you hear something that's shocking, don't be shocked. Don't give away your feelings. You have to control yourself. If you get mad, you get to the point where you can't talk to him anymore without wanting to punch him. Just take a break. Let's say, we'll continue this after lunch, or I'll see you at 3 o'clock, and go away and have a cup of coffee. So we were trained to be very neutral, not to let them think that we understood or sympathized or agreed or were shocked. Because a guy like Streicher, he loved the shock. He would constantly try to say something outrageous to see how you reacted. And that training was applied. So even after we were exposed to this experience that I had, for instance, and we had 2 interrogators out of 5 who were Jewish. One of them had lost his parents at Auschwitz, at Birkenau actually, which was a branch of Auschwitz. And to then be an interrogator of the men who had done this was tremendously admirable and courageous on their part, and they could do it. We had to do it. So that didn't enter into it. You just kind of had to, you were neutral. But it left you with this feeling, I never want to see this guy again, because the next time I see him, I want to take a swing at him. So by the time I got through with Nuremberg, I had it. I didn't want any more to do with Nazis. And I came back to Oberursel, and I begged my commanding officer to make me a motor pool officer. And so I got a brand new Jeep and traveled all over Europe looking for auto parts. But it was hard, but you had to suppress it. There's a little bit of humor in that too. Maybe not humor, but poignancy. I came back from this experience of delivering this convoy and came back to Luxembourg, and Colonel Andrews called me in. And he was furious because he just got orders that all the rest of the prisoners would be moved to Nuremberg the next day. So I just got back from Germany, and we were going to fly them to Nuremberg in 2 DC-3s, C-47s. So I got a good night's sleep, and then the next morning, we loaded up the rest of the prisoners. There were 19 left and we flew them to Nuremberg. We took them to Nuremberg, unloaded them. I said, goodbye, I'll never see you again. I hope you hang beautifully. And I got on an empty plane and came back to Luxembourg. So then I came to my office in the Palace Hotel. I packed my belongings and walked back to my billet where I was living in a private home. And I just carried my duffel bag, and there's a road right above the compound. And we had camouflage nets, Klieg lights, and tarpaulins hanging there so people couldn't see inside the hotel grounds. And I was just coming along this road heading toward the house that I lived in, which is just about a quarter of a mile away. And there was a Luxembourger standing by the fence, by the barbed wire fence, and on this side of the tarpaulin, he had a pipe in his mouth and a beret, his hands in his pockets, and he kept shouting, "Hallo Meyer, wie geht's in Berlin? Hallo Meyer, wie geht's in Berlin?" You know, hello Meyer, how are things in Berlin? Well, I was reminded that Goering used to give speeches in Germany, and he'd say to the people, if the Americans ever bomb Berlin, my name is Meyer. So this Luxembourger thought Goering would be inside the compound, so he was yelling, "Hello, Meyer, how are things in Berlin?" I didn't have the heart to tell him, "Hey, nobody there anymore. We just took him to Nuremberg." So he was having so much fun that I enjoyed that moment of poignancy myself. So went by and went on about my way. But that kind of represented the way of life as it was. A beautiful photo of Kaltenbrunner in that tape. You could see the scars. Right. He had scars all over his face. Kaltenbrunner was a Roman Catholic. He was an Austrian and had done he was an attorney, a lawyer, Austrian lawyer, had worked a lot of cases in the Nazi courts. You know, the Nazis there were two judicial systems in Germany. There were the FEMA courts. Those were the Nazi courts that tried only Nazis who committed crimes against other Nazis. Like when Streicher suggested that Goering's child was by artificial insemination, that it wasn't really Goering's child. Goering preferred charges against Streicher, and Streicher was tried by Judge Walter Buch, who was one of our prisoners, for this attack on Goering, and also for some other crimes that he committed against other Nazi leaders. Well, that was a Nazi court. And then there was the German court that tried you for regular crimes. But if a Gauleiter ordered somebody's execution or an anti-Semitic act of killing a Jew, that was perfectly legal. You see, it was okay to kill Jews in Germany, legally. So they never committed a crime. Wilhelm Frick, the Minister of the Interior, his defense was, I didn't do anything wrong. I can prove to you that I obeyed the law. He obeyed the German law, the Nuremberg law. Jews couldn't marry Germans. Germans couldn't marry Jews. They couldn't date each other. Jews weren't allowed to own shops. They weren't allowed to vote. They weren't allowed to be citizens. And became, after the assassination of Heydrich in Czechoslovakia, the village of Lidice was razed, and the men were executed, the women and children were put in concentration camps. A real crime against humanity. And Heydrich, of course, had been assassinated. Kaltenbrunner took his place. He was in charge of the SS concentration camp guards, the the Sicherheitsdienst, which is the headquarters of the security service. And they had jurisdiction over the Einsatzgruppen, and those are the guys who executed people at will. They were legally thugs who could shoot anybody they wanted to. I don't like your looks, you look like a Jew, boom. And all of those police, Secret Service, were all under Kaltenbrunner. He stood about 6'4", and you saw the scar. He had one scar that your photo doesn't show, on the left side from his nose to his ear, a vicious scar. Some of that he got dueling at the university. Anyhow, he was very vicious, and we wanted him very much alive. I didn't care, but Colonel Andrews. So when we moved the prisoners to Nuremberg on these DC-3s, Colonel Andrews decided he should have a special escort, and he handcuffed me to Kaltenbrunner. And I was the smallest guy there. So I was handcuffed to Kaltenbrunner, sitting on these planes. These DC-3s are very flimsy. I mean, the doors, you push the door open, it would fly open. And if this guy had decided to jump off the plane, commit suicide, I'd have gone right with him, because I was handcuffed to him. So, but he decided to die a more glorious death at the hangman's noose. He was very docile, and by then, as I said, he was Roman Catholic, who'd fallen away, and we had a Catholic priest, American, and also a Catholic chaplain in Nuremberg, Father Garrett Gay and Father O'Connor. And Father O'Connor actually took his confession and was his chaplain right up to the very end when he was hanged. But Kaltenbrunner's whole explanation was, I did my duty. I didn't necessarily agree, and I'm really not anti-Semitic, except in those cases where the Jews committed crimes, where they cheated people, or where they brought in fellow Jews under the house of Rothschild and confiscated other people's property illegally. And I thought they should be punished. But if they didn't commit any crimes, I didn't have any feelings about them. He said on one occasion, he actually told Hitler that he objected to the Jews being persecuted at large. And Hitler actually got angry with him. So he did his duty. He was an obedient public servant. And he had nothing against Jews or anybody. And he believed in the German supremacy and Germany winning the war, and he fought for that. But he was not necessarily in sympathy with all the rest of this stuff.
That's true.
Well, we knew better.
Yep. The Lipizzan Stallions, how that all set up, are you connected with not only Patton, but Holton? And
Yeah. Well, that was just another one of those. We always say somebody was at the right time at the right place. Well, I happened to be at the right time, the right place at the right time. I had found out toward the end of the war, just the first week in May, I was going around wherever I wanted to go. You know? Sometimes we checked the weather report. If it didn't rain someplace, that's where we were going. And I found out that my old division in Camp Chaffee, 16th Armored Division, was up near the Czechoslovakian border near Bamberg, near Bad Hof, near Bamberg. So I decided I'll go up there and see if they had any prisoners that I could interrogate. But mostly I would see some friends from my old outfit. So my driver and I went on up to Bad Hof. And there the unit was run by the 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment, which is the oldest cavalry regiment in the history of the United States on active duty. They were still there 40 years later when I was an ambassador.
I got it.
But they were on duty then, Bad Hof. So I arrived there, and I reported to commanding officer, Colonel Reed, and I told him what I was looking for, and he said, well, we don't have any prisoners, but so I visited some of my friends. I did locate a couple of guys that I knew, and they sent for me. Colonel Reed sent for me. They had brought in a German prisoner who had given himself up, and he wanted to be interrogated. And Colonel Reed couldn't speak German, so he called for me. Hey, glad you're here. I want you to interpret for me. So I came in, and this was a German captain who had voluntarily surrendered. He belonged to a unit called Dienststelle Ost, Service Station East. That was a code name for a German intelligence unit that was gathering information about the Soviets. And just like we were gathering information about the Germans, in our place in the Ardennes, we were in a hunting lodge. They were in a hunting lodge in a Bohemian forest, about 5 miles east of us. And we were the front line. Our armored cavalry regiment was doing a reconnaissance just outside of Czechoslovakia, Pilsen, Pilsen, Czechoslovakia, in the Ardennes, in the Bohemian forest. And this unit had been gathering information about the Soviets, and they were afraid the Russians, who were about 10 miles to the east of them, would get to them first, and they'd be taken prisoner by the Soviets. And if they'd find out they'd been gathering information, interrogating prisoners about the Soviets, off for their heads. So they wanted to surrender to the Americans.
Sure.
So we accepted their surrender, and Colonel Reed assigned a GI truck and a Jeep, or I had my Jeep, to take the truck to this headquarters 5 miles in the forest and get their documents and everything they had. Maps about Soviet Union, Soviet airports, everything we wanted to know about the Soviet Union that they had gathered, which our intelligence wasn't interested in because they were our allies. So we had a little problem, but that's another story. We were very naive in that respect. But we went, and I had escort, we arranged a surrender, and the colonel, lieutenant colonel in the Luftwaffe, Colonel Holters, was my prisoner, and he rode in the Jeep with me. And on the way back to our headquarters, he told me about the Lipizzaner horses. I knew nothing about them, but a Spanish riding school, and he was worried because there was a stud farm not very far from where we were. And he was afraid the Russians would get to that stud farm and they'd butcher all those beautiful horses, which were the white Lipizzanas of Spanish riding school. The mares, this was a stud farm. The stallions were in Austria. They had been evacuated to a place called St. Martin's im Innkreis, another farm there. But the mares and the foals and some stallions were in this breeding farm, this stud farm. So when I heard that and the story, I said, well, let's go look, check it out. So I made a left turn. We went about maybe a mile down the road and came to the stud farm where all the foals, and there's about 200 these beautiful horses out in the pasture. It was in May, beautiful spring day, and the horses were doing their airs above the ground, which come natural to them, jumping, kicking out the foals, especially the little horses, just really entertaining us. So we were able to send an intelligence report about that, and I reported to Colonel Reed, which is just about a mile away, and he sent a tank company to surround the stud farm, and we moved the horses into Germany, out of the reach of the Soviets. And Colonel Pataisky, who was the commander of the Spanish riding school, was at the stud farm at that time, and that's how I met him. Meanwhile, the stallions performed for the 20th Corps headquarters. General Walker, I forget his first name, was the commander of the 20th Corps, and he invited General Patton to the farm where the Spanish riding school stallions had been brought out of Vienna, and they put on a show for General Patton. And then Patton put all Lipizzaner horses under the protection of the United States Army, including the ones that we had just brought out of Czechoslovakia, the stud farm. So Patton saved the Lipizzanas, a stud farm. But an historic remark that he made when he was introduced to the Lipizzanas and told about the Spanish riding school, where these beautiful horses performed the dances and airs above the ground and all of the different terms that they use. Patton says, language which I won't use, but to quote Patton, he couldn't understand that. Why, oh yeah, how many guys did they use to train these horses? And he said, well, there were 58 of them. And he said he couldn't believe it. They used 58 healthy guys to teach horses how to dance instead of putting them in uniform and teaching them to fight. And that was a famous Patton quote, which I think I have in my book. You know. The quote I got when we visited the Spanish riding school in 1965, we visited the stables, and some tourist, some lady, asked one of the stable hands, what good are these horses? You know, they don't pull carts, they don't fight in a war or anything. What are they good for? And I'll never forget that guy's answer. He says, lady, what is a ballet good for? That was his answer to the Spanish, about what the Spanish riding school is good for. To entertain, to dance. That's what they're good for.
Walt Disney did a movie about this.
Yep, the dancing, the miracle of the white horses, isn't it? Or no, my dancing white horses. I forget. No, the miracle of the white stallions.
Yeah, Miracle of the White Stallions.
Colonel Pataisky wrote a book called My Dancing White Stallions, and the movie was based on his book.
And you're in the movie.
The Disney.
So
Yeah, the interpreter who comes to the colonel to interpret, but in the movie, he tells the colonel that the prisoner told him about a horse farm. And that isn't the way it worked. The prisoner was actually somebody who told us about the intelligence station. And as a result of our liberating it and bringing the commanding officer back, and he told me about the stud farm, and then I told Colonel Reed about what we learned. So,
But for you, Patton wouldn't have looked so good.
they were good. I was, I mentioned Patton. Our paths kept crossing during the war, after the war. He was the military governor of Bavaria, and I would go on different missions. One of them transporting us General Warlimont, and we passed Patton on the road. And this General Warlimont was the deputy chief of operations who planned the defense and the offense, the invasion of the Soviet Union, and the defense for the Normandy invasion. He was the third highest in the German general staff, and he was my prisoner, traveling with me in a Jeep. We'd gone to get some documents, and Patton drove by us in his staff car with his dog sitting in the back seat, ugly dog. Yeah. And I jumped out of the Jeep and I saluted him. Patton raised his riding crop, and that was it. But if Patton had known that the general, a three-star general who had planned the defense in the Battle of the Bulge, not the Battle of the Bulge, the Normandy invasion, was actually sitting in my Jeep, that had been an interesting meeting.
Yes.
And I probably would have gotten it in the neck for riding around the countryside with three-star German generals. And then I attended Patton's funeral, Christmas 45, in Luxembourg. He's buried in Luxembourg. Never dreaming then that 40 years later, I would be the ambassador and stand at that grave, Lord, hundreds of times in the course of 4 years. Every time a veterans group came to Luxembourg, they visited the military cemetery. 5,074 Americans buried there, all lost in the Battle of the Bulge. And Patton's grave is at the head of the 5,074. We lay a wreath. We've done that so many times. And my log showed that I visited that cemetery officially 69 times in 10 months in 1945. Well, the 40th anniversary of the end of the war. And veterans groups would come. They wanted to go visit Patton's grave, and the ambassador would be invited to talk to them. So about 2 or 3 times a week, I'd be going out there to give a talk at the Patton's grave. So that's why my book is The Pattern of Circles.
Well, one of the people you'll meet tonight is Raleigh Kidder. Raleigh Kidder is one of 11 members of the U.S. military Battle Monument
Commission. Oh, is that right? Well, they were responsible for the general. Oh, I think I mentioned him in my book. I can't think of his name right now. Who was in charge of the Battle Monuments Commission? I have to look it up in the book.
Yeah. So Raleigh, you'll meet him tonight.
You probably know him then.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, I don't want to say it, but I'm wearing you out, and this is unbelievable.
You're getting there. You're doing fine.
Well, I want to get
I'm wearing you out too.
No, I want to get you back to talk off so we can.
Okay, yeah.
Have
Just
take a deep breath before tonight.
We're doing well. I told my wife I'd probably be back around 3 o'clock. Going after 3, so.
Wow.
Thank you.
Closely with Supreme Court Justice Robert H. Jackson comes to Jamestown today. Ambassador John Dolibois interrogate the men later prosecuted by Jackson during the Luxembourg trial. He was working for the Procter & Gamble when he got his draft letter. Ironically, he was born in Luxembourg, the country where the Nazi officials were held before trial. His knowledge of the German language made him an ideal interrogator. He says he worked with Jackson to figure out the Nazi party system and the personalities of the accused Dolibois, along with 4 others, Hotel as the prisoners.
We were worried about their wanting to commit suicide. There were no door locks, no doorknobs, no screws, bolts, anything they could use.
Dolibois would interrogate the prisoners and then send their responses to Jackson in Paris. He was named ambassador to Luxembourg by President Reagan. He's now 83 years old.